an amazing response by Governor Ron DeSantis to an invitation to appear on The View. This is really, really funny. So The View emailed DeSantis' office asking for DeSantis to come on the show. And the DeSantis team then put out a statement explaining their response, which was no. Here is what their letter said. Quote, "Thanks for the invite. I understand you're sending this request on behalf of your team. Are the hosts of The View really interested in hearing from Governor DeSantis about all of the important work he is doing on behalf of Floridians to protect their health and livelihoods, to stand up for parents and children, to defend freedom? Which of the below statements from the hosts of The View do you recommend our team consider when deciding if the interview will be a genuine pursuit of the truth or worth the time? Joy Behar, August 2021. You're just short of calling DeSantis a negligent, homicidal sociopath because that's what he is." She added, "What is he doing? He's risking the lives of children, children's parents, their grandparents, anyone they may come into contact with, so he can appeal to his white supremacist base so he can continue in his career and get reelected." Sunny Hostin, June 2022. "Death Santis. I think he's a fascist and a bigot." Anna Navarro, April 2022. "It's anti-black, it's anti-gay, it's anti-LGBTQ plus community. For some reason, the Republican base responds to it. It's anti-American. It's what happens in Venezuela. It's what happens in Nicaragua." Sunny Hostin, February 2022. "It started with CRT. These are anti-history laws, anti-black history laws, really. If you start coming after black people, what comes next? Right? Of course, the LGBTQ plus community, and then women, and then other marginalized groups. We will pass on this offer. Also, please note, we don't coordinate appearances or events of a political nature from our official role. Our role is to serve the people of Florida. Thank you, Press Secretary, Executive Officer of the Office of the Governor." This is a proper response. I would say that is a proper response. Well, some really terrible news out of Indiana. Apparently, Republican Representative Jackie Walorski, who represents Indiana's 2nd Congressional District, was among 3 other people who died in a car crash Wednesday afternoon in the Hoosier State, according to Breitbart. According to the Elkhart County Sheriff's Office, the crash happened Wednesday at approximately 12:32 p.m. The Elkhart County Sheriff's Office responded to a 2-car crash on SR 19. A northbound passenger car traveled left of center, collided head-on with a southbound sports utility vehicle. The Sheriff's Office noted all 3 occupants in the vehicle heading southbound, including Walorski, Zachary Potts, and Emma Thompson, died as a result of their injuries. The single occupant in the vehicle heading northbound, a woman named Edith Schmucker, was pronounced deceased at the scene as well. So everyone was killed in the crash. Terrible, terrible story. Kevin McCarthy released a statement from the Walorski office. Dean Swihart, Jackie's husband, was just informed by the Elkhart County Sheriff's Office Jackie was killed in a car accident this afternoon. She's returned home to be with her Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Please keep her family in your thoughts and prayers. We have no further comment at this time. So that, of course, is a terrible story, and our hearts go out to the family of this Congresswoman. Horrible, horrible story. Meanwhile, there's a lot of speculation humming around that the Justice Department is focusing in on a criminal investigation of President Trump. According to Andrew McCarthy over at National Review, the Justice Department's issuance of a grand jury subpoena to former White House counsel Pat Cipollone signals the criminal investigation of former President Trump is ramping up. Last month, Cipollone agreed to sit for an interview with the House January 6th committee. It's important to understand that was a heavily negotiated appearance in which conditions laid out by Cipollone had to be accommodated. Under DOJ guidance that has long been followed by administrations of both parties, the president's top advisors claim absolute immunity from compliance with congressional subpoenas. Moreover, as the lawyer for the president, the White House counsel is obliged by attorney-client privilege to maintain the confidentiality of communications. The theory of executive immunity from congressional information demands is rooted in the separation of powers of the Constitution. Ordinarily, this immunity is aggressively defended by the DOJ, an important executive branch component. It's notable that the DOJ has substantially refrained from defending executive privilege in connection with the January 6th committee investigation. This is because Biden hasn't supported Trump's attempts to invoke executive privilege in this investigation. However, a current or former executive branch official's constitutionally based immunity from congressional inquiries does not extend to inquiries undertaken by the DOJ. The DOJ is conducting a criminal investigation, so there are no real fences to what they can ask. Going back to the Watergate era, the Supreme Court and lower courts have reasoned there is a higher public interest at stake in criminal investigations of public officials than in congressional inquiries. Ergo, unless prosecutors had concluded Cipollone possessed information vital to possible criminal charges, they would not have subpoenaed him to appear before a grand jury. The Justice Department itself has issued the subpoena to the former White House counsel. Virtually all criminal investigations in which executive privilege claims have arisen have been conducted by specially appointed prosecutors. These prosecutors are lawyers brought in from outside the government when the DOJ is laboring under a conflict of interest, most often because the DOJ, part of the incumbent administration, is investigating members of the same administration. Although special prosecutors are technically part of the DOJ, they operate with a wide berth of independence, says Andy McCarthy. Typically, they're not indulgent to privileges that empower the administration to conceal information. So, for example, Ken Starr, when he was independent counsel, subpoenaed Clinton Deputy White House counsel Bruce Lindsay and Sidney Blumenthal. By contrast, the DOJ has a high interest in maintaining the full scope and potency of executive privilege, and thus ordinarily fights hard to defend and preserve them. So it's telling the DOJ itself has issued the subpoena to Cipollone in a situation that triggers both executive privilege and attorney-client privilege. If the DOJ is fighting to pierce rather than preserve those privileges, Cipollone and his private lawyers won't have much luck asserting those privileges. They might try to assert executive privilege, but because President Biden has basically waived executive privilege, those assertions would be likely to fail. As for attorney-client privilege, Cipollone probably would not get very far with that either. To repeat, he was not the president's private lawyer. He represented Trump in the conduct of lawful presidential duties and only in the conduct of those duties. When attorney-client communications are sought by prosecutors, it's usually in a context where either the communications were arguably not privileged because they didn't involve legal advice, or the crime fraud exception to the privilege applies. In other words, if you're trying to commit a crime with your lawyer, then you don't get to claim privilege. Based on recent reporting, we can conclude that this past spring, the focus of the DOJ's investigation shifted from the violence of the riot to the activities of then-President Trump. The emerging theory appears to be as follows. Trump and his advisors initially hoped to reverse the outcome of the election by a flurry of lawsuits charging fraud and other election irregularities, which they implausibly hoped would inspire Republican-controlled legislatures to invalidate the popular vote and substitute their own conclusion Trump had won. The Trump team assembled alternative slates of Trump electors who would be responsible for casting these states' electoral votes for Trump if their legislatures could be convinced to overturn Biden's popular vote wins. In talking among themselves, even the Trump insiders referred to these purported slates as fake electors. Still, it appears that many of the Trump supporters who agreed to be electors saw themselves as contingent. In other words, they weren't fake. They might be kicked into place. This idiotic plan had no prospect of success. Not a single state legislature cooperated. When it became clear they were getting nowhere, Trump's minions settled on a new, similarly inane strategy that targeted the January 6th joint session of Congress, convincing Pence to refuse to count the slates. In that implausible scenario, congressional Republicans would object to the counting of the state votes. Pence would sustain the objections. Notwithstanding the hyperbole of the January 6th committee and the media Democrat complex, our democracy was not hanging by a thread. This scheme also had no chance of success, but the scheme doesn't have to have a chance of success in order for it to be an actionable conspiracy under federal criminal law. So it's looking a lot like Merrick Garland is getting active here, which again, makes sense. He's under a lot of pressure from Democrats here. If he doesn't get active, Biden is the one who's going to pay the price for the January 6th committee. Did you know that every single like creates one additional leftist tier? That is just science.